The horizon was not merely dark, it was moving. To the citizens of medieval Delhi, standing upon the ramparts of their fortified city in the closing weeks of the year 1299, the sight was the manifestation of an apocalypse foretold in hushed whispers across the known world. It was a cloud of dust that stretched for miles, kicked up by 200,000 hooves, a living storm composed of the most terrifying military force history had ever witnessed. The Mongols had arrived. For decades, the Mongol war machine had ground civilizations into dust. From the steppes of Central Asia, they had swept west into Europe and south into the heart of the Islamic world, sacking Baghdad and turning the Tigris River black with ink and red with blood. They were the undoing of empires, the scourge of God, a force of nature that did not negotiate and did not stop. They had knocked on the doors of India before, raiding the borderlands, testing the defenses, probing for weakness. But this time was different. This was not a raiding party looking for plunder. This was an invasion force looking for a crown. At the head of this Leviathan rode Kutla Khwaja, a prince of the Chagatai Khanate, a man who had inherited the bloodlust of Genghis Khan and the strategic brilliance that had allowed the Mongols to conquer half the globe. He did not come to loot the suburbs of Delhi and retreat. He came to exterminate the Khilji dynasty and turn the Indian subcontinent into a pasture for Mongol horses. Inside the city, panic was not just a feeling, it was a physical weight. The streets were choked with refugees who had fled the countryside, bringing with them tales of horror. Villages burned, fields salted, and pyramids of skulls left as grim markers of the Mongol advance. The mosques were full of weeping prayers, and the markets were silent, paralyzed by the anticipation of doom. The general consensus among the nobility, the scholars, and the seasoned veterans of the Delhi Sultanate was clear. They believed that to fight the Mongols in the open field was suicide. The only hope, they argued, was to barricade the gates, hide behind the thick stone walls, and pray that the heat of the Indian summer or the lack of fodder would drive the invaders away. But on the throne of Delhi sat a man who did not understand the concept of hiding. Alauddin Khilji was a usurper, a murderer, and a tyrant. He had ascended to the throne by assassinating his own uncle and father-in-law, buying the loyalty of the army with gold, and silencing dissent with the sword. He was a man of boundless ambition and terrifying ruthlessness. Yet, in this moment of existential dread, he was exactly what India needed. When his advisors, trembling in their robes, suggested diplomacy or a siege defense, Alauddin looked at them with cold contempt. He told them that he would not hide like a rat in a hole. He would march out to the plains of Kili and meet the Mongols head-on. It is difficult to overstate the insanity of this decision. The Mongol army was the masters of open-field warfare. Their horse archers could ride circles around heavy cavalry, raining death from a distance, feigning retreat to draw enemies into traps, and maneuvering with a coordination that seemed telepathic. To meet them on the open plains was to play their game by their rules. But Alauddin had a card to play that the Mongols did not anticipate. He had a weapon forged in the fires of constant warfare, a weapon that possessed a ferocity to match their own. It was not a machine, nor a tactic, but a man and the legion he commanded. This is the story of that collision. It is the story of how the unstoppable force of the Mongol Empire crashed into the immovable object of the Delhi Sultanate. It is the story of the Battle of Kili, and the day Delhi's secret weapon broke the spine of the Mongol invasion. To understand the gravity of the Battle of Kili, one must first understand the precarious position of the Delhi Sultanate at the turn of the 14th century. India was a jewel that every conqueror coveted. It was a land of immense wealth, fertile rivers, and teeming populations. But it was also a fractured land, a patchwork of kingdoms and rajadoms that were often as busy fighting each other as they were watching the mountain passes to the northwest. The Sultanate, established a century earlier, was the shield of India. It controlled the critical obsession of the north, the gateway through which all land-based invasions had to pass. But the Sultanate was internally volatile. Dynasties rose and fell with bloody regularity. Alauddin Khilji had only recently seized power in 1296. His legitimacy was thin. The people feared him, but they did not yet love him. The nobility tolerated him, but they were waiting for him to fail. If he showed weakness in the face of the Mongols, his own generals would likely cut his throat before the invaders even reached the palace. Alauddin knew this. He knew that a king who hides behind walls ceases to be a king in the eyes of his subjects. He understood the psychology of power better than perhaps any ruler of his age. In a famous exchange with his loyal advisor and the Kotwal of Delhi, a man named Ala-ul-Mulk, the Sultan laid out his philosophy. The advisor begged him not to risk the kingdom on a single battle, citing the overwhelming numbers of the Mongols and their undefeated record. Alauddin replied that while the advisor spoke the wisdom of administration, he, Alauddin, spoke the logic of sovereignty. He argued that if he retreated now, he would be remembered as a coward for all of history, and his authority would evaporate. He essentially declared that he would rather die on the battlefield defending his right to rule than live as a sultan in a cage. And so, the order was given. The great war drums of Delhi began to beat. The gates were thrown open, not for refugees to enter, but for the army of Islam to exit. Alauddin Khilji marched out of Delhi with a force that was impressive by any standard, though likely outnumbered by the Mongol horde. Historical accounts vary, as they always do, but it is estimated that he fielded nearly 300,000 men, comprised of heavy cavalry, war elephants, and infantry. However, numbers in medieval warfare can be deceiving. The quality of the troops, their discipline, and their morale were the deciding factors. The army marched to the plains of Kili, a vast stretch of open ground a short distance from the city. This was to be the killing field. Alauddin organized his forces with meticulous care. He took the center for himself, surrounding himself with his elite guards and the royal canopy, making himself a visible anchor for the army's morale. On the left wing, he placed his brother, Ulu Khan, a capable commander who had served him well in the conquest of Gujarat. But it was the right wing that held the key to the battle. This wing was entrusted to Zafar Khan. Zafar Khan was a figure of legendary proportions in the chronicles of the time. He was the Mir-e-Ars, the Minister of War, but those titles did justice neither to his skill nor his temperament. He was a warrior of the old school, fearless, aggressive, and possessed of a physical strength that was the subject of soldiers' tales around campfires. He commanded the elite heavy cavalry of the Sultanate, men clad in chainmail and plate, riding armored war horses that were bred for impact. Zafar Khan had spent his life fighting on the frontiers. He knew the Mongols. He had fought them in skirmishes and border raids. He respected their lethality, but he did not fear them. In fact, there was a simmering rivalry between Zafar Khan and the Mongol commanders. They knew his name, and they knew that he was the one man in the Indian army who fought with the same primal intensity that they did. The two armies encamped facing each other, separated by a stretch of no man's land that seemed to hum with tension. The sight must have been breathtaking and terrifying. On one side, the endless sea of Mongol yurts and the rough, hardy ponies of the steppe. On the other, the organized lines of the Delhi army, with their colorful banners, the gleam of polished steel, and the towering shapes of war elephants, beasts that the Mongols despised and feared for their ability to break cavalry formations. The Mongols, led by Kutluk Khwaja, were confident. They had swept through the Punjab with ease. They had bypassed other fortresses to strike directly at the head of the snake. They expected the Indians to be slow, cumbersome, and easily confused by the rapid maneuvering of the steppe tactics. They expected to draw the Indian heavy cavalry out, tire them, surround them, and butcher them. It was the tactic that had destroyed the knights of Europe and the armies of China. But the Battle of Kili would not follow the Mongol script. As the sun rose on the day of battle, the air was filled with the guttural cries of the Mongols and the rhythmic chanting of the Indian Roops. The initial skirmishes began. Arrows flew in dark clouds, darkening the sky. The Mongol horse archers rode forward, released their volleys, and wheeled away before the Indian infantry could engage. It was a dance of death, a test of patience. Alauddin Khilji from the center maintained strict discipline. He knew that if his formation broke, if his men chased the Mongols prematurely, they would be slaughtered. He ordered his commanders to hold the line, to absorb the arrow fire, and to wait for the opportune moment. But Zafar Khan, on the right wing, saw something different. He saw a challenge. Zafar Khan was not a man who waited. He observed the Mongol left wing, which was probing his defenses, testing the resolve of his men. He realized that the Mongols were treating them with a lack of respect, assuming they would sit passively and take the punishment. A fury rose within the general. He decided that the best defense was an attack so violent that it would shatter the psychological advantage of the invaders, without waiting for orders from the Sultan, a move that was technically treasonous but tactically brilliant. Zafar Khan ordered his wing to charge. This was the unleashing of Delhi's secret weapon. It was not a hidden cannon or a mystical fire. It was the kinetic energy of thousands of heavy cavalrymen slamming into the Mongol lines with zero hesitation. Zafar Khan led from the front. The thunder of his cavalry drowned out the screams of the battlefield. They did not trot, they did not canter, they galloped at full speed, a wall of iron smashing into the light cavalry of the Mongols. The Mongols were caught completely off guard. They were used to enemies, who fought cautiously. They were used to enemies who tried to preserve their formation. They were not used to a general who rode straight at them with the ferocity of a demon. Zafar Khan's charge broke the first line of the Mongol left wing instantly. The momentum carried them through to the second line. The sword work of Zafar Khan became the stuff of legend that day. Chronicles describe him cutting through the Mongol ranks as a hot knife cuts through wax. He was unstoppable. His men, inspired by his reckless bravery, fought with a fanaticism that matched the invaders. The Mongol left wing, commanded by brave but surprised generals, began to crumble. They could not loose their arrows effectively because the Indians were in their faces, slashing and stabbing at close quarters. Panic, a sensation alien to the Mongol horde, began to ripple through their left flank. They turned and fled. This was the critical moment. In a standard battle, a commander would halt, regroup, and protect the main army's flank. But Zafar Khan was consumed by the battle lust. He saw the enemy running, and he gave chase. He pursued them for miles, driving them away from the battlefield, slaughtering stragglers, ensuring that they could not regroup. However, in his zeal, Zafar Khan made a fatal error. He had separated himself entirely from the main body of Alauddin's army. He had created a gap that a more coordinated enemy could exploit. But more importantly, he had ridden into a trap. The Mongol retreat, while initially genuine due to the shock of the charge, quickly turned into their classic feigned retreat. Kutluk Khwaja, observing the battle from a vantage point, saw that the Indian right wing had detached itself. He saw the opportunity. He signaled his elite Tumans, units of 10,000, to circle back. Zafar Khan, miles away from support, suddenly found the horizon darkening once again. The Mongols he was chasing stopped, and from the ridges on his flanks, fresh Mongol units appeared. An ambush. He was surrounded. The hunter had become the prey. The scene that followed is one of the most poignant in Indian military history. Zafar Khan, realizing his isolation, did not panic. He looked around at his dwindling force. The Mongols, recognizing the quality of the warrior they had trapped, actually paused. It is said that Kutluk Khwaja was so impressed by Zafar Khan's bravery that he sent a messenger offering him safe conduct and a high rank in the Mongol army if he would surrender. Zafar Khan's response was to shoot the messenger's horse. He shouted that he knew no master but the Sultan and no duty but to drive the invaders from his soil. He tightened the girth of his saddle, checked his sword, and prepared for the end. The final stand of Zafar Khan was a whirlwind of violence. Surrounded on all sides, pounded by arrows, he and his remaining men fought until their horses collapsed. Dismounted, Zafar Khan continued to fight on foot. The Mongol chronicles themselves mention him with a mixture of hatred and awe. They recount how he kept the Mongol soldiers at bay, how his armor was pierced in a dozen places, yet he refused to fall. Eventually, the sheer weight of numbers prevailed. A rain of arrows finally brought the great general down. Zafar Khan died on the dust of Kili, miles away from the king he served, abandoned by the brother generals who had been too jealous or too cautious to come to his aid. But his death was not in vain. In fact, it was the blow that saved Delhi. While Zafar Khan was being martyred, the main Mongol army was in a state of shock. They had witnessed the destruction of their left wing. They had seen a ferocity in the Indian troops that they had not anticipated. Kutluk Khwaja, the Mongol commander, had won the skirmish against Zafar Khan, but he had lost the psychological war. The Mongols were practical warriors. They fought for gain, for conquest, and for glory. But they did not fight battles they could not win without. Pyrrhic losses. The mauling their left wing had taken proved that the Delhi army was not a soft target. Furthermore, during the engagement, Kutluk Khwaja himself had been injured. The invincible aura of the horde had been punctured. Night fell over the battlefield of Kili. Both armies retreated to their camps. The air was thick with the screams of the dying and the smoke of fires. Inside the Delhi camp, the mood was somber. They knew Zafar Khan was lost. Alauddin Khilji, despite his relief that the line had held, was furious at Zafar's recklessness, but secretly relieved that a potential rival was gone. Politics never stopped, even in war. But in the Mongol camp, the mood was even darker. The commanders gathered. They looked at their casualties. They looked at the endless ranks of the Delhi army that still stood firm in the center. They remembered the mad general who had charged them like a demon. They whispered that if the Sultan had more men like Zafar Khan, a prolonged battle would result in the annihilation of the Mongol force. The terror of the secret weapon, the realization that the Indians could outfight them in close-quarters combat, had done its work. The next morning, as the sun rose, the sentries on the walls of Delhi and the scouts of Alauddin's army looked out toward the Mongol lines, expecting the second wave of the assault. They expected the drums, the arrows, the screams. Instead, they saw dust. But this time, the dust was moving away. The Mongols were retreating. They had broken camp in the night and were marching back toward the mountain passes, back toward Central Asia. They had decided that Delhi was a nut too hard to crack. The sacrifice of Zafar Khan and the sheer immensity of the resistance had convinced the heirs of Genghis Khan that this land was not ready for the taking. The relief in Delhi was indescribable. The city that had prepared for death was suddenly given a new lease on life. Alauddin Khilji returned to the city not just as a sultan, but as a savior. He had rolled the dice on the open field and won. The Battle of Kili was a turning point in world history. Had the Mongols won that day, the history of the Indian subcontinent would have been irrevocably rewritten. The Sultanate would have collapsed. The cities of the north would have been razed. The culture, the architecture, the lineage of India would have been subjected to the same devastating reset that had befallen Persia and Mesopotamia. Instead, the Mongol tide broke against the Rock of Kili. Alauddin Khilji would go on to become one of the most powerful, albeit cruel, rulers in Indian history. He would implement massive military reforms, creating a standing army paid in cash, branding horses to prevent corruption, and setting price controls in the markets to ensure his soldiers could afford food. He turned the Delhi Sultanate into a military state capable of withstanding future Mongol incursions, of which there were many. But never again did the Mongols come so close to extinguishing the light of Delhi as they did in 1299. As for Zafar Khan, his name passed into folklore. For years afterward, it is said that when a Mongol horse refused to drink water, the rider would ask the beast, "Why? Have you seen Zafar Khan?" His memory became a ghost that haunted the steppes, a reminder that in the hot plains of India, there were warriors who could look the dragon in the eye and not blink. The secret weapon of Delhi was not magic. It was the spirit of resistance. It was the refusal to bow to the inevitable. It was the courage to charge into the teeth of the storm. The narrative of Kili serves as a stark reminder of how thin the line is between survival and annihilation. It teaches us that in the face of overwhelming odds, the calculus of logic often dictates surrender, but the logic of survival dictates aggression. Alauddin Khilji provided the will, but Zafar Khan provided the spark. We often look at history as a series of dates and maps, lines moving back and forth. But we must remember the human element. We must visualize the dust choking the lungs, the vibration of the ground, the smell of sweat and fear. We must imagine the silence of the council when Alauddin chose to fight. We must imagine the roar of Zafar Khan as he spurred his horse forward. In the grand tapestry of the medieval world, the Mongols were the dominant thread, weaving a pattern of conquest from the Pacific to the Mediterranean. But at Kili, that thread was cut. It was cut by a dynasty that refused to die, and a general who didn't know how to retreat. The legacy of this battle echoes through the centuries. It secured the political continuity of North India for another 200 years. It allowed the Indo-Islamic culture to flourish, blending the Persian and local traditions into the rich mosaic we see today. It proved that the Mongols, for all their terror, were mortal. They could bleed, they could fear, they could run. As the dust settled on the plains of Kili in the closing days of the 13th century, the people of Delhi could breathe again. The storm had passed, but the lesson remained. Peace is not a gift, it is a prize won by the sword. And sometimes, the only way to stop a monster is to become a greater monster yourself. This was the lesson of Alauddin Khilji. This was the sacrifice of Zafar Khan. And this was the day Delhi's secret weapon destroyed the myth of Mongol invincibility. In the end, history belongs to the bold. The timid are forgotten, buried under the rubble of their own caution. But those who ride out to meet their fate, even if they fall, leave a mark that endures long after the stone walls have crumbled to dust. The Battle of Kili stands as a testament to that eternal truth.